will have your badge for this. I have done nothing to warrant this treatment. I am not resisting. You're assaulting me.
Get out of the car now. I don't care if you're the Queen of England. You're getting out and you're going to the ground. Do not resist me.
67 seconds. That's all it took for Officer Kyle Brennan to transform what should have been a routine speeding stop into a viral catastrophe that would cost him his freedom, obliterate his partner's career, and force the Wilmington, North Carolina Police Department to write an $11.2 million check, the largest civil rights settlement in the state's history. The aggressive command cut through the afternoon air like a blade. Get out of the car. Now, I don't care if you're the Queen of England, you're getting out and you're going to the ground. Do not resist me. And then, strained through gasps as her body struck the scorching pavement for the third time in just over a minute, came the response that would echo across every major news network in America. My attorney will have your badge for this. I have done nothing to warrant this treatment. I am not resisting. You're assaulting me. This is assault. Someone is recording this. The woman Officer Brennan violently dragged from her $240,000 Bentley Bentayga. The woman he threw to the ground 3 separate times with such force that her kneecap shattered and her temple split open against the asphalt, wasn't just another black motorist he could brutalize with impunity. She was Vivian Crawford, 39-year-old founder and CEO of Axiom Technologies, a cybersecurity firm valued at $1.2 billion that held lucrative contracts with the Department of Defense, 17 Fortune 500 companies, and 3 separate federal agencies. She had a master's degree from MIT, a TEDx talk that had garnered over 4 million views, and had been featured in Forbes' Most Powerful Women in Tech issue just 6 months earlier. She was scheduled to testify before the Senate Commerce Committee about data privacy legislation in exactly 2 weeks. But in that brutal 67 seconds on the side of Highway 17 at precisely 2:47 p.m. on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, none of her accomplishments mattered to Officer Brennan. None of her credentials registered. None of her humanity showed through. Because when Kyle Brennan looked at Vivian Crawford, he saw something else entirely, something he and his partner would articulate with shocking clarity in the 7 minutes of conversation they believed was private, a conversation captured on body cameras they thought had been turned off, a conversation so vile and so explicitly racist that it would trend worldwide for 6 consecutive days and force a reckoning that reached all the way to the governor's office. This is the story of 67 seconds of documented violence, 7 minutes of recorded hatred, and one woman's absolute refusal to let either be swept under the institutional rug that has protected racist policing for generations. Before we go any further into this story, a story that will challenge you, enrage you, and hopefully inspire you, I need you to understand something. Stories like Vivian Crawford's don't get told enough. They don't get amplified enough. They don't reach the audiences that desperately need to hear them. If powerful stories, voices, and black triumphs matter to you, if you believe that accountability and justice deserve a platform, subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV right now. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what brought you here today, and share this video so these stories travel further than algorithms alone would ever allow them to go. Because every single subscription, every like, every share is a vote that these narratives matter, that our voices deserve space, and that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, needs to be heard. Now, let's talk about how a routine traffic stop became a national referendum on racism in American policing. Vivian Crawford wasn't supposed to be in Wilmington that Tuesday afternoon. Her calendar had her scheduled to be 3,000 miles away in San Francisco at Axiom Technologies' gleaming headquarters in the financial district, running final preparations for a major product launch that would revolutionize encrypted communications for government agencies. The launch represented 18 months of development work, $40 million in research and development investment, and potentially $200 million in first-year revenue. Everything was on track. Everything was proceeding according to plan. And then her phone rang at 6:47 that morning, her mother's number flashing across the screen with that particular urgency that makes your stomach drop before you even answer. Dorothy Crawford, 68 years old and a retired schoolteacher who'd spent 43 years shaping young minds in North Carolina's public school system, had woken up with severe chest pains radiating down her left arm. The paramedics were already on their way. She was being transported to Wilmington Medical Center. She didn't want Vivian to worry, but she thought her daughter should know. Vivian caught the first available flight out of San Francisco International, her executive assistant frantically rebooking meetings and rescheduling conference calls while Vivian sat in the airport lounge trying to keep her hands from shaking as she researched cardiac symptoms on her phone. The flight felt interminable, 5.5 hours of turbulence and terrible coffee while she oscillated between reassuring herself that her mother was strong and healthy and imagining worst-case scenarios that made her chest tighten with anxiety. She landed in Raleigh just after 1 p.m. Eastern Time, raced through the airport to the rental car counter, and took the only luxury vehicle they had available, a gleaming black Bentley Bentayga with cream leather interior and enough horsepower to make the 2-hour drive to Wilmington in considerably less time if traffic cooperated. She was worried. She was distracted by that specific kind of fear that comes from knowing your parent is mortal and vulnerable and possibly in serious danger. And yes, she was speeding, 79 miles per hour in a clearly marked 65-mile-per-hour zone on Highway 17, 14 miles over the posted limit, pushing the Bentley harder than she should have because every minute felt like it mattered, because every second delayed was another second she wasn't at her mother's bedside. When the blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror at 2:46 p.m., Vivian's heart sank with a resignation that every black person who's ever been pulled over understands intimately. Not now, she thought. Not today. Not when her mother was in the hospital. But she knew better than to keep driving, better than to do anything except exactly what she'd been taught since she was 16 years old and her father sat her down for the talk that black parents have with their children about surviving encounters with police. She signaled carefully, pulled smoothly onto the wide shoulder of the highway, put the Bentley in park, turned off the engine, placed both hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel where they would be clearly visible, and waited with the practiced compliance that shouldn't be necessary but absolutely is when you're black in America. Officer Kyle Brennan, 34 years old and a 7-year veteran of the Wilmington Police Department with a personnel file that included 3 prior complaints for excessive force, all dismissed as unfounded by Internal Affairs, approached the Bentley with his hand already resting on his service weapon. This was unusual protocol for a straightforward speeding stop on a clear afternoon with no signs of danger, no indication of criminal activity, nothing to suggest that the driver posed any kind of threat whatsoever. His partner, Officer Jericho Webb, 41 years old with 12 years on the force and a reputation for keeping his head down and his mouth shut, approached the passenger side but hung back several feet, watching the interaction unfold with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned that intervening in a fellow officer's stop could create problems. Brennan stopped at the driver's side window and rapped his knuckles against the glass with more force than necessary, the sharp sound making Vivian flinch slightly. "License and registration," he demanded through the closed window, not a request, not a polite inquiry, but a command delivered with an edge of aggression that immediately set Vivian's internal alarm bells ringing. She pressed the button to lower the window, the Bentley's electric mechanism operating with the kind of whisper-quiet precision that luxury engineering provides, and she reached slowly and deliberately toward her purse in the passenger seat, announcing her movements exactly the way her father had taught her. "Officer, I'm reaching for my purse now to get my license and registration." "Hands? Let me see your hands." Brennan shouted, his weapon now drawn and pointed directly at her head, his voice sharp with an aggression that seemed wildly disproportionate to the situation. Vivian's hands shot up immediately, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mouth suddenly dry with the kind of fear that comes from knowing that black people have been shot for less, killed for reaching for wallets and registration and cell phones because officers feared for their lives. Her voice remained steady through sheer force of will, years of high-stakes business negotiations kicking in even as terror flooded her system. "Officer, I was reaching for my license and registration. You just asked me for my license and registration. Step out of the vehicle. Now." Brennan's weapon remained trained on her, his finger alongside the trigger guard, his body language broadcasting threat and aggression. Vivian's mind raced through the legal framework she knew from her position on Axiom's corporate board, from the civil rights organizations she'd donated to, from the countless conversations she'd had with attorneys about constitutional law. She knew that Pennsylvania versus Mims established that officers could ask drivers to exit vehicles during traffic stops. She knew she was legally required to comply with that order. But she also knew that the weapon drawn, the shouting, the aggressive posture, none of it was standard protocol for a speeding violation. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. "Officer, I'm happy to comply with your instructions, but can you please tell me why you're pointing a weapon at me? I haven't done anything to." "I'm not going to ask you again. Out of the car. Move." Vivian, her hands still raised and clearly visible, began to reach with her right hand toward her seatbelt buckle, moving slowly and deliberately, trying to show through her body language that she posed absolutely no threat whatsoever. "I need to unbuckle my seatbelt, officer. I'm doing that now." But she wasn't moving fast enough for Kyle Brennan, whose patience, what little he'd started with, had evaporated entirely. He holstered his weapon with one hand and yanked the driver's door open with the other, then grabbed Vivian's left arm and pulled with enough force to drag her halfway out of the vehicle before the seatbelt caught, the strap biting into her chest and neck as her body lurched forward and then stopped abruptly, trapped. "I'm still buckled. Please, the seatbelt, I can't," Vivian gasped out, her free hand scrabbling at the seatbelt release, but Brennan wasn't listening, wasn't paying attention to her words or her obvious inability to comply with his orders while still restrained. He reached across her body with his left hand, found the seatbelt release button, and pressed it with enough force that the mechanism clicked loudly. The belt retracted immediately, and without that restraint, when Brennan pulled again on Vivian's arm, she came out of the vehicle completely, all 5 feet 4 inches and 128 pounds of her leaving the ground entirely as his superior size and strength launched her body out of the Bentley's cabin and directly toward the unforgiving surface of the highway shoulder. Her right knee struck the sun-heated asphalt first, the impact sending a bolt of white-hot agony up her leg that made her cry out involuntarily. Later, X-rays would reveal a fractured patella, a broken kneecap, and a completely torn meniscus that would require surgical repair and 6 weeks of limited mobility followed by 3 months of intensive physical therapy. But in that moment, there was no time to register the extent of the injury, no time to process the damage, because Brennan was already forcing her face down onto pavement that radiated the afternoon's 91-degree heat like a griddle. His knee pressed into her back between her shoulder blades, his full weight, 215 pounds according to his department physical, compressing her lungs and making it difficult to draw a full breath. "Give me your hands." "Stop resisting," he shouted, even though Vivian wasn't resisting, hadn't resisted, was doing everything she could to comply despite the pain and the fear and the complete inability to understand what was happening or why. "I'm not resisting," she managed to gasp out, her cheek pressed against the road surface hard enough that she could feel individual pieces of gravel digging into her skin, hard enough that the heat from the pavement was burning the side of her face. "I'm not." Brennan wrenched her right arm behind her back with such force and at such an extreme angle that Vivian screamed, the hyperextension of her shoulder sending fire through the joint and down her arm. He yanked her left arm back with equal violence, and the handcuffs clicked into place around both wrists so tightly that the metal bit into her skin, so tightly that the circulation to her hands was immediately compromised, so tightly that the forensic photographs taken 6 hours later would show deep purple bruising and broken skin where the cuffs had cut into her flesh. "Stand up," Brennan ordered, his knee still pressing into her back, making it physically impossible for her to rise even if her damaged knee could have supported her weight. "I can't, you're on top of me, I can't," Vivian tried to explain, but Brennan was already grabbing the chain connecting the handcuffs and hauling upward, using the worst possible leverage point, wrenching both of her shoulders backward and upward in a way that the human skeletal structure simply isn't designed to move. Vivian got halfway to her feet, her weight balanced precariously on her one good leg while her injured knee buckled beneath her, unable to bear even a fraction of her body weight. She fell, hit the pavement again with bruising force, her right temple striking the ground hard enough that stars exploded across her vision and the world tilted sickeningly. "I said stand up. Stop resisting." Brennan shouted again, as though her falling was an act of defiance rather than the predictable result of a shattered kneecap and compromised balance. He hauled her up by the handcuff chain again, and again Vivian's damaged knee gave out, and again she fell, this time scraping the entire right side of her face against the asphalt as she went down, feeling skin tear and blood begin to flow hot and sticky down her cheek. 3 times. In 67 seconds, Vivian Crawford hit the ground 3 times, each impact adding to the catalog of injuries that would eventually be documented in meticulous detail by forensic photographers and medical professionals. Fractured patella, torn meniscus, rotator cuff strains in both shoulders requiring months of physical therapy, facial lacerations requiring 14 stitches, contusions covering approximately 40% of her body, and post-traumatic stress disorder that would be formally diagnosed by a forensic psychiatrist and would persist for years after the physical wounds had healed. What Officer Kyle Brennan didn't know, what he couldn't have seen because he was so focused on subduing a woman who had never resisted, was that 4 separate people were recording every single second of the assault. A truck driver named Dalton Reeves, pulled over on the shoulder approximately 100 yards ahead to check his load securing, had a continuously running dashcam that captured the entire interaction from a frontal angle. A 17-year-old girl named Shanice Kimmons, sitting in the back seat of her mother's sedan stopped in traffic behind Vivian's Bentley, started recording on her phone the instant she saw Brennan draw his weapon. A motorcyclist named Travis Kellerman, a decorated Army veteran who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, slowed his bike when he witnessed the violent extraction and captured everything on his helmet camera, so disturbed by what he was seeing that he would later drive directly to the Wilmington Police Department to file a formal complaint. And Vivian's own Bentley, equipped with a sophisticated security system that included multiple cameras that activated automatically whenever the engine was running, recorded the entire assault in crystal-clear 4K resolution from angles that would prove absolutely devastating in court. 4 angles. 4 witnesses. 4 pieces of irrefutable evidence that would become exhibits in both criminal and civil proceedings. Officer Jericho Webb stood approximately 15 feet away during the entire 67-second assault. He didn't participate in the violence, didn't put his hands on Vivian Crawford, didn't drag her from her vehicle or throw her to the ground or wrench her arms behind her back with enough force to cause lasting damage. But he also didn't intervene. Didn't tell his partner to stop. Didn't suggest that maybe, possibly, the level of force being used against a woman who clearly wasn't resisting was excessive and unjustified and potentially criminal. He just watched with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned long ago that speaking up against a fellow officer's conduct, no matter how clearly wrong, could end your career faster than almost anything else. His silence made him complicit. His inaction made him guilty. And the law would eventually recognize both. Finally, with Vivian barely conscious from pain and shock and the repeated head trauma of hitting pavement 3 times in just over a minute, Brennan hauled her to her feet one final time and walked her, half-dragged her really because her injured knee couldn't support her weight, to his patrol car. He opened the rear door and shoved her inside with enough force that she fell across the back seat, unable to catch herself with her hands still cuffed behind her back. Her head struck the opposite door, adding another contusion to the growing collection. Vivian's purse, a Hermes Birkin bag worth approximately $45,000, a gift she bought herself when Axiom Technologies hit its first billion-dollar valuation, remained in the Bentley's passenger seat. Inside the purse, her phone, her wallet containing her driver's license and 6 credit cards, $800 in cash, her insurance cards, her business cards, and a pair of diamond stud earrings worth $12,000 that she'd removed during the flight from San Francisco because they'd been uncomfortable. Standard protocol required Officer Brennan to inventory the vehicle's contents, to secure any valuables, to ensure that property belonging to an arrested individual was properly documented and protected. He did none of these things. He simply closed the Bentley's driver's door, didn't lock it, didn't secure it, and walked back to his patrol car, leaving $45,000 worth of purse and its valuable contents sitting in an unlocked vehicle on the side of a public highway where anyone could access it. By the time Vivian was processed and released from custody 6 hours later, by the time she posted the $5,000 bond that had been set for the completely fabricated charges of reckless driving and resisting arrest, every single item from that purse was gone. Stolen. The purse itself, the phone, the wallet, the cards, the cash, the earrings, everything. Taken by someone who'd seen an opportunity and seized it while police were supposed to be protecting and securing the property of a citizen in their custody. Material possessions could be replaced, of course. Vivian could buy another phone, could cancel the credit cards, could file insurance claims and purchase new items to replace the stolen ones. But the violation ran deeper than mere theft. The message was clear. Even your property isn't safe when police decide you don't deserve protection. But as devastating as the assault had been, as violating as the theft was, as traumatic as the entire experience had become, none of it compared to what happened in the next 7 minutes and 43 seconds, while Vivian sat handcuffed and bleeding in the back seat of the patrol car and 2 white officers discussed her humanity, or rather, their perception of her complete lack thereof. I want to pause here because what I'm about to share with you, the conversation that was recorded on body cameras that Officers Brennan and Webb believed had been turned off, is going to be difficult to hear. It's going to make you angry. Should make you angry. Because this is the reality of what some officers think about black people when they believe no one is listening. Every story we tell here at Bold Black Watch TV is bold, unflinching, and necessary. Every voice matters, especially the voices that expose the truth about systemic racism in institutions that are supposed to serve everyone equally. If this story has moved you, if Vivian Crawford's experience has resonated with you or made you think differently about policing in America, then hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment telling us your thoughts, your experiences, or your reactions. And help us amplify these stories about justice that absolutely deserve to be heard by sharing this video as widely as you possibly can. Now, let's talk about the 7 minutes that ended 3 careers and exposed the racist rot at the heart of the Wilmington Police Department. Vivian sat in the back seat of the patrol car, her hands still cuffed behind her back, the metal biting into her wrists where the cuffs had been fastened too tightly, cutting off circulation to the point where her fingers were starting to go numb and tingly. Her knee throbbed with a deep, pulsing agony that made her stomach turn. Her head pounded from the repeated impacts against pavement and car door. Blood from the laceration on her temple had dried sticky and uncomfortable down the side of her face. Her designer dress, a cream-colored Armani that had cost $3,200 and that she'd worn to look professional for what she'd thought would be a quick hospital visit before catching a red-eye back to San Francisco, was torn at the shoulder seam and covered in road dirt and bloodstains. She was trying to control her breathing, trying to manage the pain, trying to process what had just happened and why and what it meant. She was trying to hold herself together despite the terror that had flooded her system when Brennan drew his weapon, despite the humiliation of being thrown to the ground like garbage, despite the complete violation of everything she'd believed about her place in the world and her right to be treated with basic human dignity. The partition between the front and back seats of the patrol car was closed, a standard security measure designed to separate officers from potentially dangerous prisoners. But what Officers Brennan and Webb either didn't know or didn't remember in that moment was that the partition didn't provide sound isolation. Voices carried through clearly. Every word spoken in the front seat could be heard perfectly in the back. And their body cameras, mounted on their chests in compliance with department policy and North Carolina state law, were still recording. Sergeant Henderson from an earlier shift had implemented a new camera system 3 months prior. One with a feature specifically designed to prevent officers from hiding misconduct by manually deactivating their cameras during critical encounters. When an officer reached up to turn off their camera, the system didn't actually stop recording. Instead, it activated a continuous recording mode that couldn't be disabled without physically removing the camera itself and pulling the battery. Brennan thought he'd turned his camera off when he reached up and pressed what he believed was the power button after securing Vivian in the back seat. Webb thought the same when he performed the identical gesture moments later. They were both catastrophically wrong. The cameras were recording everything, capturing audio with perfect clarity, preserving every word for posterity and for the criminal prosecutors who would eventually use it to destroy their freedom. Officer Brennan climbed into the driver's seat, his breathing still elevated from the physical exertion and adrenaline of the confrontation. Officer Webb settled into the passenger seat, and for a long moment, perhaps 15 or 20 seconds, neither man spoke. The silence stretched out, filled only with Brennan's gradually slowing breaths and the distant sound of traffic on Highway 17. Then Webb, clearly trying to make sense of what he'd just witnessed, what he'd just stood by and watched happen without intervention, spoke carefully, his tone carrying an edge of confusion and perhaps the faintest hint of concern. "What the hell was that, man? She wasn't doing anything. Why'd you pull her out like that?" Brennan's response came immediately, defensive and aggressive, his voice tight with the kind of anger that suggested he knew on some level that he'd crossed a line but absolutely refused to acknowledge it. "Did you see the car she was driving? Did you see it, Jericho? A $250,000 Bentley. The way she was dressed, all that expensive designer shit. Someone driving a car like that, dressed like that, in this neighborhood? She's either a drug dealer running product up from Miami, or she stole that vehicle from someone who actually belongs in it. I don't trust it." My instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. In the back seat, Vivian went absolutely still, her breath catching in her throat as the implications of Brennan's words sank in like stones in deep water. These people. She didn't belong in the car. Someone who actually belongs in it. Webb's voice carried uncertainty now, a questioning tone that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the direction this conversation was heading. She had the registration right there in the glove compartment. Her name was on it. Vivian Crawford. The car was registered to her company, Axiom something. It was her car, Kyle. "I don't care what the registration said," Brennan shot back, his voice hardening with conviction. "I don't care whose name was on the paperwork. These people think they can just buy their way into our communities, drive whatever luxury vehicles they want, speed however they want, act like they own the roads, and we're just supposed to what? Smile and wave and give them a warning? Send them on their way with a polite, 'Have a nice day, ma'am'? That's not how this works. That's not how any of this should work." Vivian felt tears, hot, furious tears born of rage and humiliation and absolute disbelief, begin to slide down her cheeks, mixing with the dried blood and road dirt. She'd built a billion-dollar company from nothing but an idea and endless hours of coding in a cramped apartment while putting herself through MIT. She'd created jobs for hundreds of people. She'd paid millions in taxes to this state. She'd donated to schools and community centers and scholarship funds. And to this officer, to Kyle Brennan, None of that mattered because she was black and therefore didn't belong in a luxury vehicle or an affluent neighborhood. Webb spoke again, his voice quieter now, taking on that particular tone that white people sometimes use when they're about to reveal the racist beliefs they normally keep hidden. You really think she stole the car? I think she didn't belong in it, Brennan repeated, each word clipped and final. I think people like her don't earn cars like that through legitimate means. I think we both know exactly how she probably paid for it, if she paid for it at all. Then Webb asked the question that would become the most infamous quote of the entire case, the words that would be replayed on every major news network in America, the sentence that would trend worldwide and would be cited in federal legislation about hate crimes and policing. Why do you think so many of them are like this? Prone to violence? Combative? I swear, every stop with black drivers turns into some kind of confrontation. What is it about them? Vivian's blood turned to ice in her veins. So many of them. What is it about them? Spoken so casually, so conversationally, as though her humanity was a topic appropriate for philosophical speculation rather than a settled question with only one correct answer. Brennan responded with the confidence of someone who'd thought extensively about this question, someone who'd developed a comprehensive racist ideology and was pleased to have an opportunity to articulate it. You want the truth, Jericho? You really want to know what I think? I can give you a really good idea of why it might be that way. Yeah, I'm curious what you think. They're violent in nature, Brennan stated flatly, as though reciting an established fact rather than expressing a vile racist belief. It's just how they're built. It's biology. Look at crime statistics if you don't believe me. Who commits the most violent crime in this country? Who fills up our prisons? It's not white people. It's not Asians. It's them. Black people. And that's not racism, that's just data. That's just reality that we're not supposed to acknowledge because it's not politically correct. Webb made a small sound of agreement, a quiet ha, that suggested he was absorbing this racist propaganda and finding it persuasive. Brennan continued, warming to his subject now, his voice taking on an almost lecturing quality, and it's not just the violence either. Look at them. I mean, really look at them. The facial structure. The build. The way they move. They look like apes. It's basic evolutionary biology. They're closer to primates than they are to actual humans. You can see it in the bone structure, in the musculature, in everything about their physical presentation. Vivian felt as though she'd been punched in the stomach, all the air leaving her lungs in a rush. She'd known racism existed, of course. She'd experienced microaggressions throughout her career, assumptions that she was someone's assistant rather than the CEO, surprised that someone like her could run a tech company, the subtle condescension that came from people who couldn't quite reconcile her race with her accomplishments. But this was different. This was being compared to an animal, having her humanity explicitly denied, listening to two armed officers discuss her as though she were a different species entirely. And they're dirty, Brennan added, his voice dripping with contempt. Dirty like pigs. You ever noticed that? How their neighborhoods always look. Trash everywhere, lawns overgrown, houses falling apart, no pride in ownership, no cleanliness, no standards whatsoever. It's genetic. It has to be genetic because you see the same patterns everywhere black people live, no matter what city, no matter what state. They just don't have that civilized instinct that tells people to maintain their property and respect their communities. Webb's response was quiet but chilling in its casual agreement. My cousin who works for Atlanta PD says the exact same thing. Says the black neighborhoods down there are absolute disaster zones. Says you can literally smell them before you see them. Because it's true, Brennan insisted, his voice rising with righteous conviction. And we're not allowed to say it's true anymore because of political correctness and Black Lives Matter and all that activist bullshit. But everyone knows it. Every cop knows it. Every white person who's ever lived near them knows it. Everyone sees it, but we're all supposed to pretend we don't, supposed to pretend there's no difference, supposed to treat them like they're equal when the evidence of our own eyes tells us they're not. 7 minutes and 43 seconds. That's how long the conversation continued, with Brennan expounding on his racist ideology and Webb occasionally interjecting with agreement or his own examples of black criminality and unworthiness. 7 minutes and 43 seconds of the most explicitly racist policing conversation ever captured on official law enforcement recording equipment. Vivian heard every single word. She sat 3 feet away from these men, handcuffed and bleeding and unable to escape, forced to listen as they discussed her, and everyone who looked like her, as subhuman. She would later tell her therapist that those 7 minutes were worse than the physical assault, worse than the pain of her shattered knee or her wrenched shoulders. The violence had hurt her body, but this conversation had assaulted her soul, had tried to strip her of her humanity, had forced her to confront the depth of hatred that existed behind the badge and the uniform. But while Brennan and Webb believed they were having a private conversation that would never see the light of day, the body cameras faithfully recorded every word, every racist epithet, every dehumanizing comparison, every piece of evidence that would eventually be used to destroy their careers and their freedom. The patrol car eventually pulled into the Wilmington Police Department parking garage at 3:52 p.m. Vivian was processed through a system that treated her like a criminal, photographed with blood still dried on her face, her torn dress hanging off one shoulder, her eyes swollen from crying. The mug shot would later be released to the press and would become its own kind of viral image, a stark visual representation of what happens when racist policing meets a black woman regardless of her accomplishments or her wealth or her absolute compliance with every command. She was fingerprinted, her injured hands screaming with pain as her fingers were pressed against the scanner. She was placed in a holding cell for 4 hours while the fabricated charges of reckless driving and resisting arrest were processed. She was finally allowed to make a phone call at 6:30 p.m., and she called her executive assistant with instructions to post whatever bond was required and to contact her general counsel immediately. At 8:47 p.m., more than 6 hours after being violently extracted from her vehicle, Vivian Crawford walked out of the Wilmington Police Department as a free woman on $5,000 bond. She was limping badly, her injured knee swollen to nearly twice its normal size and unable to bear her full weight. She was still wearing the torn, blood-stained dress. Her purse was gone, stolen from her unsecured vehicle. Her phone was gone. Her wallet, her credit cards, her cash, her jewelry, all gone. She didn't go straight to the police department to report the theft. She went to Wilmington Medical Center, where her mother Dorothy was resting comfortably in a private room, the chest pains having been diagnosed as severe acid reflux rather than cardiac arrest. Vivian held her mother's hand, reassured her that everything was fine, didn't mention the assault or the arrest or the theft. Didn't want to worry a 68-year-old woman who just had a medical scare. Then she checked into a hotel, ordered room service she couldn't eat because her stomach was still churning with adrenaline and shock, and sat alone in the darkness of her room trying to process what had been done to her and what she'd heard and what it all meant. And then, at 11:30 p.m., sitting in that hotel room with her body aching and her knee throbbing and her mind replaying those 7 minutes of racist conversation on an endless loop, Vivian Crawford made the decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to quietly pay her fines and accept the unjust charges and move on with her life grateful that it hadn't been worse. She wasn't going to be another black person brutalized by police whose story disappeared into the void of systematic indifference. She was going to fight back with every resource at her disposal. And she had considerable resources. She picked up the hotel phone and called Diane Rothman, her general counsel, a Harvard Law School graduate who'd been with Axiom Technologies since Vivian had incorporated the company in her tiny apartment 9 years earlier. "Diane," Vivian said, her voice steady despite the pain and the exhaustion and the trauma, "I need you to retain the best civil rights attorney in North Carolina. I don't care what it costs. I need someone who specializes in police misconduct, someone with a track record of winning impossible cases, someone who isn't afraid to take on an entire police department. And I need them ready to file suit by Friday." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and then Diane asked the obvious question, "Vivian, what happened?" And Vivian told her. All of it. The traffic stop, the drawn weapon, the violent extraction, the assault, the 3 falls to the pavement, the theft of her property, the fabricated charges. And finally, most importantly, the 7-minute conversation she'd been forced to overhear, every racist word that Brennan and Webb had spoken while believing they were having a private discussion. Diane was silent for a long moment after Vivian finished speaking. Then she said, her voice tight with fury, "I'll make the calls tonight. We'll have someone by tomorrow morning." What Vivian Crawford did next, the decision she made to fight rather than accept what had been done to her, is why we tell these stories at Bold Black Watch TV. Because silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Because accepting brutality as inevitable is surrender. Because every time we amplify these stories, every time we make sure they're heard and seen and understood, we're participating in the long, difficult work of creating accountability. Bold Black Watch TV is more than just a channel. It's a community of people who believe that justice matters, that truth matters, that powerful black narratives deserve to be celebrated and protected and shared. Subscribe right now if you haven't already. Hit that like button to tell the algorithm that this content matters. And join us as we continue to bring you stories about justice, culture, and the black experience in America that mainstream media too often ignores. Now let's talk about what happened when Vivian Crawford hired the most fearsome civil rights attorney in North Carolina. By 9 a.m. the following morning, Wednesday, less than 24 hours after the assault, Vivian Crawford was sitting in the downtown Raleigh offices of Mitchell & Associates Civil Rights Law, one of the most respected and most feared civil rights litigation firms in the southeastern United States. The firm's senior partner, Amara Mitchell, had built her reputation over 15 years by taking on seemingly impossible cases against law enforcement agencies and winning judgments and settlements that forced systemic change. She'd secured over $47 million in civil rights settlements across her career, had been featured on 60 Minutes for her work dismantling racist policing practices in 3 different police departments, and had testified before Congress on 4 separate occasions about the need for comprehensive police reform and federal accountability standards. Amara listened to Vivian's account without interruption, taking detailed notes in handwriting so precise it looked almost like printing, asking occasional clarifying questions to nail down specific timelines and exact quotations. She reviewed the photos Vivian had taken of her injuries, the swollen knee, the facial lacerations, the bruising on her wrists from the too tight handcuffs, the contusions covering her arms and legs. She examined copies of the fabricated charges. She made notes about the stolen property and the failure to secure Vivian's vehicle. When Vivian finished her account, Amara set down her pen, made direct eye contact, and asked the most important question of the entire consultation. "Ms. Crawford, I need to understand your goals before we proceed. Do you want justice, real, public, systemic justice that might change how this police department operates? Or do you want the situation to go away quietly? Because those are 2 very different paths, and they require 2 very different strategies. One path gets you a settlement check with a confidentiality agreement that protects the department's reputation and changes nothing. The other path puts you on national television, makes you a public figure in a highly controversial case, subjects you to scrutiny and criticism and probably death threats from racists who hate seeing black women fight back, but it also creates the possibility of real accountability and lasting change. So I need to know, which path do you want to walk?" Vivian didn't hesitate for even a fraction of a second. "I want every single person in America to see what they did to me. I want everyone to hear what they said. I want those officers prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned. I want them fired with such public shame that no other police department in this country would even consider hiring them. And I want the Wilmington Police Department to pay enough money, enough that it actually hurts their budget, enough that every city council member and every police administrator feels the financial pain, that they never, ever forget what it costs to hire and protect racist officers. I want systemic change, Attorney Mitchell. I want accountability. I want justice. And I don't care how difficult or uncomfortable or public that process becomes." Amara smiled, a small, fierce smile that suggested Vivian had just said exactly what she'd hoped to hear. "Then let's get to work. Because we're about to make Wilmington PD wish they'd never heard the name Vivian Crawford." The legal team that Amara assembled moved with the kind of coordinated precision that only comes from years of experience in high-stakes civil rights litigation. Their first action was filing a comprehensive public records request for all body camera footage, dash camera footage, and radio communications from the traffic stop. North Carolina's public records law gave the Wilmington Police Department 72 hours to comply with the request. The department immediately stalled, claiming that the footage was part of an ongoing criminal investigation into Vivian's charges and therefore temporarily exempt from public disclosure under investigative privilege. It was a standard delaying tactic, one that police departments used regularly to prevent damaging footage from reaching the public until they'd had time to develop a narrative and control the story. Amara had anticipated this exact response. Within 6 hours of receiving the denial, she filed an emergency motion in Superior Court arguing that the investigative privilege didn't apply when the underlying charges were fabricated and pretextual, when the public interest and transparency overwhelmed any legitimate investigative concerns, and when the department had a clear conflict of interest in investigating its own officers' potential criminal conduct. The judge, a no-nonsense jurist named Harrison Caldwell who had a reputation for not tolerating police department stonewalling, reviewed the motion and the department's opposition and issued an order from the bench that same afternoon: release the footage within 24 hours or face contempt charges and daily fines of $10,000. The Wilmington Police Department released the footage the following morning. When Amara's legal team reviewed the body camera recordings, they found everything they needed and more than they dared hope for. The footage from Brennan's camera showed the entire violent extraction from multiple angles as he moved around the vehicle. The audio captured every command, every one of Vivian's attempts to comply, every cry of pain. And then, most devastatingly, most perfectly for the prosecution of both criminal and civil cases, the cameras had captured all 7 minutes and 43 seconds of the racist conversation in the patrol car with absolutely crystal clear audio quality. Simultaneously, Amara's investigators were tracking down the civilian witnesses. The truck driver, Dalton Reeves, provided his dashcam footage immediately and eagerly, so disturbed by what he'd witnessed that he'd actually filed his own complaint with the police department the same day, a complaint that had been dismissed as unsubstantiated by the department's Internal Affairs Division within 48 hours without any apparent investigation. The teenage girl, Shanice Kimmons, was initially terrified of retaliation against herself or her family, but her mother, a 43-year-old black woman named Lorraine who'd had her own traumatic experiences with police throughout her life, sat her daughter down and explained why coming forward mattered, why silence protected abusers, why the only way things would ever change was if people were willing to stand up and tell the truth even when it was frightening. Shanice agreed to testify and provided her phone video. The motorcyclist, Travis Kellerman, was so disgusted by what he'd witnessed that he'd already driven to the police department immediately after the incident to file a formal complaint and offer his helmet camera footage as evidence, an offer the department had declined with barely concealed hostility. The evidence kept mounting. Amara's team obtained the Bentley's internal security footage, multiple cameras and 4K resolution showing the assault from inside the vehicle, including the moment when Brennan drew his weapon without any justification whatsoever, the violent extraction, all three falling to the pavement. Medical records documented the full extent of Vivian's injuries, the fractured patella that would require surgical repair involving 2 hours of orthopedic surgery and the insertion of 4 surgical screws to stabilize the bone, the completely torn meniscus, the bilateral rotator cuff strains, the facial lacerations that required 14 stitches, the extensive bruising and contusions and, critically for the damage calculations, the post-traumatic stress disorder that was formally diagnosed by Dr. Helena Winters, a forensic psychiatrist with 30 years of experience evaluating trauma and victims of police violence. The financial damages were calculated with meticulous precision. $47,000 in medical expenses including surgery, hospitalization, physical therapy, and ongoing psychiatric treatment. $52,000 in lost property. An estimated $340,000 in lost business opportunities because Vivian missed the Senate testimony that would have generated significant publicity for Axiom Technologies and missed 2 critical investor meetings during her recovery period, and punitive damages to be determined at trial but certain to be substantial given the egregious nature of the conduct and the explicitly racist motivation captured on audio. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after Officer Brennan had pulled Vivian Crawford over for speeding, Amara Mitchell held a press conference on the steps of the Wake County Courthouse. Every major news outlet in North Carolina was there. CNN had sent a crew. So had MSNBC. The Associated Press, Reuters, the New York Times, the Washington Post. The media presence was massive because Amara's office had sent out a press advisory the previous afternoon that promised explosive new evidence in a case of racist police brutality that will shock the nation. Amara stood at a podium bristling with microphones, flanked by her legal team and by Vivian Crawford herself, who stood straight and dignified despite the visible evidence of her injuries, the slight limp, the surgical bandage on her knee visible beneath her skirt, the healing laceration on her temple, the careful way she held her shoulders to minimize the pain from her rotator cuff strains. "Good morning," Amara began, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd with the kind of practiced authority that comes from years of high-profile litigation. "My name is Amara Mitchell, and I represent Dr. Vivian Crawford, the founder and CEO of Axiom Technologies. Today, on Dr. Crawford's behalf, I am filing a federal civil rights lawsuit under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 against Officer Kyle Brennan, Officer Jericho Webb, and the Wilmington Police Department for deprivation of constitutional rights, excessive force, false arrest, malicious prosecution, conspiracy to violate civil rights, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligent retention and supervision of officers with known propensities for racist violence." The reporters erupted with questions, but Amara raised her hand for silence and continued, "Dr. Vivian Crawford was violently assaulted during what should have been a routine traffic stop for a minor speeding violation. She was dragged from her vehicle, thrown to the ground 3 separate times with enough force to fracture her kneecap and require surgical intervention, suffered multiple additional injuries that I will detail momentarily, and was then forced to sit handcuffed in a patrol car while the officers who had just brutalized her engaged in a conversation. A conversation they believed was private but which was captured on their own body cameras, in which they discussed black people, including Dr. Crawford specifically, as violent in nature, comparing black people to apes and to pigs, and explicitly articulating the racist beliefs that motivated the excessive force. She paused, letting the weight of those words sink in, watching the reporters' faces shift from professional skepticism to genuine shock. "I have here," Amara continued, holding up a flash drive, body camera footage from both officers, dash camera footage from civilian witnesses, and security camera footage from Dr. Crawford's vehicle that documents every single second of this assault and the racist conversation that followed. "I am providing copies of this footage to all media outlets present today because the public has a right, the absolute right, to know what is being done in their name with their tax dollars, by officers who took an oath to protect and serve all citizens equally regardless of race." She turned slightly to gesture toward Vivian. "Dr. Crawford is a tech CEO. She holds a master's degree from MIT. She has created hundreds of jobs. She has contributed millions in taxes to North Carolina. Her company holds contracts with the Department of Defense and multiple federal agencies. But none of that should matter. Because even if she wasn't any of those things, even if she was unemployed, even if she'd never graduated high school, even if she was struggling financially instead of being successful, she would still deserve to be treated with dignity and respect by law enforcement. She would still have constitutional rights that officers are required to honor. She would still be a human being whose life and safety and well-being matter." Amara's voice hardened, taking on an edge that made several reporters lean forward instinctively. But Officers Brennan and Webb didn't see a human being when they looked at Vivian Crawford. They saw an ape. They saw a pig. They saw someone they could brutalize without consequence because of the color of her skin. They said these things out loud, on camera, with the kind of casual certainty that suggests these aren't aberrant thoughts but deeply held beliefs that inform their policing decisions every single day. She held up the flash drive again. They were catastrophically wrong about one thing: they thought there would be no consequences. They thought they could turn off their cameras and their racism would remain private. They thought they could file false charges and Dr. Crawford would just accept them and move on because that's what usually happens when police brutalize black people. They thought wrong. The footage dropped that afternoon at 2 p.m. across every major news platform simultaneously. Amara's team had provided high-quality copies to dozens of news organizations with the stipulation that they all release it at the same moment to maximize impact and prevent any one outlet from scooping the others. Within 2 hours, the video had been viewed 10 million times on Twitter. Within 6 hours, it was the #1 trending topic worldwide. Within 24 hours, the view count had exceeded 89 million across all platforms: Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, news websites, everywhere. The video was absolutely devastating in its clarity and its completeness. Viewers watched a calm, compliant black woman sitting in her vehicle with both hands visible on the steering wheel. They watched an officer draw his weapon for no discernible reason. They watched the violent extraction, saw Vivian's body literally leave the ground as Brennan yanked her from the Bentley. They watched her hit the pavement once, twice, 3 times, saw the impacts, heard her cries of pain, witnessed the obvious excessive force. They saw the blood. They saw the injury. They saw everything. And then, most damningly, most horrifyingly, they heard the audio from the patrol car. Brennan's voice, clear as crystal, utterly unmistakable. "They're violent in nature. Look like apes, dirty like pigs." 7 minutes and 43 seconds of the most explicitly racist police conversation ever captured on official recording equipment, and it was all there for the world to hear. The response was immediate, overwhelming, and sustained. The hashtag Justice for Vivian trended for 6 consecutive days. The Congressional Black Caucus issued a formal statement demanding immediate federal investigation by the Department of Justice. The NAACP called for the immediate termination and criminal prosecution of both officers involved. Tech industry leaders rallied around Vivian with unprecedented unity. The CEOs of Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and 17 other major technology companies issued a joint statement expressing support for Vivian and warning that they would seriously reconsider any business operations or investments in North Carolina if meaningful action wasn't taken to address systemic racism in the state's law enforcement agencies. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after Officer Brennan had pulled Vivian Crawford over for speeding, Amara Mitchell held a press conference on the steps of the Wake County Courthouse. Every major news outlet in North Carolina was there. CNN had sent a crew. So had MSNBC. The Associated Press, Reuters, the New York Times, the Washington Post. The media presence was massive because Amara's office had sent out a press advisory the previous afternoon that promised explosive new evidence in a case of racist police brutality that will shock the nation. Amara stood at a podium bristling with microphones, flanked by her legal team and by Vivian Crawford herself, who stood straight and dignified despite the visible evidence of her injuries. The slight limp, the surgical bandage on her knee visible beneath her skirt, the healing laceration on her temple, the careful way she held her shoulders to minimize the pain from her rotator cuff strains. "Good morning," Amara began, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd with the kind of practiced authority that comes from years of high-profile litigation. "My name is Amara Mitchell, and I represent Dr. Vivian Crawford, the founder and CEO of Axiom Technologies. Today, on Dr. Crawford's behalf, I am filing a federal civil rights lawsuit under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 against Officer Kyle Brennan, Officer Jericho Webb, and the Wilmington Police Department for deprivation of constitutional rights, excessive force, false arrest, malicious prosecution, conspiracy to violate civil rights, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligent retention and supervision of officers with known propensities for racist violence." The reporters erupted with questions, but Amara raised her hand for silence and continued, "Dr. Vivian Crawford was violently assaulted during what should have been a routine traffic stop for a minor speeding violation. She was dragged from her vehicle, thrown to the ground 3 separate times with enough force to fracture her kneecap and require surgical intervention, suffered multiple additional injuries that I will detail momentarily, and was then forced to sit handcuffed in a patrol car while the officers who had just brutalized her engaged in a conversation. A conversation they believed was private but which was captured on their own body cameras, in which they discussed black people, including Dr. Crawford specifically, as violent in nature, comparing black people to apes and to pigs, and explicitly articulating the racist beliefs that motivated the excessive force." She paused, letting the weight of those words sink in, watching the reporters' faces shift from professional skepticism to genuine shock. "I have here," Amara continued, holding up a flash drive, body camera footage from both officers, dash camera footage from civilian witnesses, and security camera footage from Dr. Crawford's vehicle that documents every single second of this assault and the racist conversation that followed. "I am providing copies of this footage to all media outlets present today because the public has a right, the absolute right, to know what is being done in their name with their tax dollars, by officers who took an oath to protect and serve all citizens equally regardless of race." She turned slightly to gesture toward Vivian. "Dr. Crawford is a tech CEO. She holds a master's degree from MIT. She has created hundreds of jobs. She has contributed millions in taxes to North Carolina. Her company holds contracts with the Department of Defense and multiple federal agencies. But none of that should matter. Because even if she wasn't any of those things, even if she was unemployed, even if she'd never graduated high school, even if she was struggling financially instead of being successful, she would still deserve to be treated with dignity and respect by law enforcement. She would still have constitutional rights that officers are required to honor. She would still be a human being whose life and safety and well-being matter." Amara's voice hardened, taking on an edge that made several reporters lean forward instinctively. But Officers Brennan and Webb didn't see a human being when they looked at Vivian Crawford. They saw an ape. They saw a pig. They saw someone they could brutalize without consequence because of the color of her skin. They said these things out loud, on camera, with the kind of casual certainty that suggests these aren't aberrant thoughts but deeply held beliefs that inform their policing decisions every single day. She held up the flash drive again. They were catastrophically wrong about one thing: they thought there would be no consequences. They thought they could turn off their cameras and their racism would remain private. They thought they could file false charges and Dr. Crawford would just accept them and move on because that's what usually happens when police brutalize black people. They thought wrong. The footage dropped that afternoon at 2 p.m. across every major news platform simultaneously. Amara's team had provided high-quality copies to dozens of news organizations with the stipulation that they all release it at the same moment to maximize impact and prevent any one outlet from scooping the others. Within 2 hours, the video had been viewed 10 million times on Twitter. Within 6 hours, it was the #1 trending topic worldwide. Within 24 hours, the view count had exceeded 89 million across all platforms: Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, news websites, everywhere. The video was absolutely devastating in its clarity and its completeness. Viewers watched a calm, compliant black woman sitting in her vehicle with both hands visible on the steering wheel. They watched an officer draw his weapon for no discernible reason. They watched the violent extraction, saw Vivian's body literally leave the ground as Brennan yanked her from the Bentley. They watched her hit the pavement once, twice, 3 times, saw the impacts, heard her cries of pain, witnessed the obvious excessive force. They saw the blood. They saw the injury. They saw everything. And then, most damningly, most horrifyingly, they heard the audio from the patrol car. Brennan's voice, clear as crystal, utterly unmistakable. They're violent in nature. Look like apes, dirty like pigs. 7 minutes and 43 seconds of the most explicitly racist police conversation ever captured on official recording equipment, and it was all there for the world to hear. The response was immediate, overwhelming, and sustained. The hashtag Justice for Vivian trended for 6 consecutive days. The Congressional Black Caucus issued a formal statement demanding immediate federal investigation by the Department of Justice. The NAACP called for the immediate termination and criminal prosecution of both officers involved. Tech industry leaders rallied around Vivian with unprecedented unity. The CEOs of Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and 17 other major technology companies issued a joint statement expressing support for Vivian and warning that they would seriously reconsider any business operations or investments in North Carolina if meaningful action wasn't taken to address systemic racism in the state's law enforcement agencies. 23 members of the United States Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, united in their disgust, signed a formal letter to the Attorney General requesting immediate federal civil rights investigation under Justice Department guidelines. Protests erupted in Wilmington, Raleigh, Durham, Charlotte, and Greensboro, with thousands of people marching peacefully through downtown streets carrying signs that read "Badge doesn't mean bigot," and "Vivian Crawford deserves justice," and "Fire racist cops." The demonstrations remained overwhelmingly peaceful, but the message was absolutely clear. The public was watching, the public was engaged, and the public was demanding accountability. And Vivian's Senate testimony, which she'd missed because she was in surgery having her fractured kneecap repaired while Officers Brennan and Webb presumably congratulated themselves on facing no consequences, was personally rescheduled by the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee. Senators from both parties called Vivian's office to apologize for what had happened, to express their support and solidarity, and to promise that her testimony would receive the attention and respect it deserved. The Wilmington Police Department, facing the most intense public scrutiny in its 147-year history, was forced to respond quickly and decisively, or at least to appear to respond quickly and decisively. This is the moment where we see what happens when racism meets accountability, when viral video meets public pressure, when one woman's refusal to accept injustice creates an opening for systemic change. What did this story mean to you so far? Has it made you think differently about traffic stops, about police accountability, about the experiences that Black people navigate every single day in America? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. Tell us your reactions, your experiences, your hopes for what justice should look like. Hit that like button to make sure YouTube's algorithm shows this video to more people who need to see it. And subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV because we're committed to bringing you powerful Black stories that challenge, inspire, and demand better from the systems that are supposed to serve us all equally. Now let's talk about what happened when the full weight of public outrage came crashing down on Wilmington PD. The Wilmington Police Department's response came in stages, each one a calculated attempt to contain the damage and manage the public relations catastrophe that was consuming the department's reputation with every passing hour that the video continued to circulate and accumulate views. Within 48 hours of the footage going viral, within 2 days of 89 million people watching Vivian Crawford being brutalized and hearing Officers Brennan and Webb's racist conversation, both officers were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. This was presented as a strong, immediate response, but veterans of police accountability battles recognized it for what it was: a standard delaying tactic that allowed officers to continue receiving full pay and benefits while the department waited for public attention to fade so they could quietly reinstate or provide generous resignation packages. But public attention wasn't fading. If anything, it was intensifying. Police Chief Thomas Randall, a 30-year veteran who'd risen through the ranks during an era when such explicitly racist policing was common and largely accepted, stood before a hastily assembled press conference looking genuinely shell-shocked by the scope of the crisis. The language and sentiments expressed by these officers, he read from a carefully prepared statement, his voice tight and uncomfortable, are abhorrent, unacceptable, and in direct violation of our department's core values, our training protocols, and everything we claim to represent as servants of this community. We are cooperating fully with the North Carolina Attorney General's investigation, and we will take appropriate disciplinary action based on the findings of that investigation. But the public wasn't interested in vague promises of appropriate action or in waiting months for an internal investigation, conducted by the same department that had employed these racist officers, ignored previous complaints against them, and created the culture that allowed such beliefs to flourish unchallenged. The people demanded immediate termination, immediate criminal charges, and immediate systemic reform, and they weren't going to accept anything less. Within 1 week, 7 days after Vivian Crawford had been pulled over for driving 14 miles per hour over the speed limit, both officers were terminated for cause. No severance packages, no negotiated resignation agreements, no preservation of pension benefits. Fired. The official termination letters cited excessive force in violation of department policy, conduct unbecoming an officer, violation of civil rights, and statements demonstrating racial bias incompatible with law enforcement service. Officer Brennan, facing termination, initially attempted to appeal through the police union, which had a contractual obligation to provide representation in disciplinary proceedings. But when the union's attorneys reviewed the footage, when they watched the assault and listened to the 7-minute racist conversation, they made a calculation that representing Brennan would damage the union's credibility so severely that it wasn't worth the fight. They declined to provide representation beyond the initial procedural filings, essentially abandoning Brennan to face the consequences alone. Officer Webb didn't even attempt to fight his termination. He resigned quietly, released a brief 2-sentence statement through his attorney acknowledging his failure to intervene and prevent excessive force, and disappeared from public view. But termination wasn't enough. Not even close to enough. The North Carolina Attorney General, Patricia Hernandez, a former federal prosecutor with a reputation for taking on difficult cases that other prosecutors avoided, announced that her office would be working in coordination with the United States Department of Justice to bring criminal charges against both officers. This was significant because it meant both state and federal charges would be filed, eliminating the possibility that a sympathetic local jury might acquit or that a friendly local judge might impose minimal sentences. The grand jury was convened within 3 weeks. Amara Mitchell testified for over 4 hours, walking the 23 citizens through not just the specific incident involving Vivian Crawford but the broader pattern of racial profiling that statistical analysis revealed throughout the Wilmington Police Department. Data showing that black drivers were stopped at 4.7 times the rate of white drivers in the same neighborhoods, that use of force incidents involved black subjects 6.3 times more frequently than white subjects despite black residents representing only 28% of the city's population, and that complaints of racial bias against officers were routinely dismissed as unsubstantiated without meaningful investigation. The body camera footage was entered into evidence, unedited, in its entirety. Every second of violence, every word of racist conversation. When the grand jury heard when they heard Officer Brennan's words about black people being violent in nature, and looking like apes, and being dirty like pigs, several grand jurors visibly recoiled with expressions of disgust and horror. When they heard the discussion of Vivian not belonging in her own vehicle, multiple grand jurors shook their heads. And when they heard the complete 7 minutes and 43 seconds of racist ideology being expressed by officers who were supposed to protect and serve all citizens equally, the grand jury's response was swift and unanimous. 10 days later, the indictments were returned. Officer Kyle Brennan was charged with deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony carrying up to 10 years imprisonment, ethnic intimidation under North Carolina state law, a felony carrying up to 5 years, assault and battery inflicting serious injury, a felony carrying up to 8 years, official misconduct, a misdemeanor, criminal threat, a felony carrying up to 3 years, and theft by law enforcement officer for failing to secure Vivian's property, a felony carrying up to 5 years. The charges were serious, the potential sentences were substantial, and the evidence was overwhelming. Officer Jericho Webb was charged with failure to intervene to prevent excessive force, a federal misdemeanor carrying up to 1 year, official misconduct, a state misdemeanor, and accessory after the fact to assault, a state felony carrying up to 3 years, for his failure to report Brennan's obviously excessive use of force and for his participation in the racist conversation that followed. Both men were arrested in coordinated early morning raids, their homes surrounded by law enforcement vehicles, their wrists placed in handcuffs, their mugshots taken and immediately released to the press. The symbolism was powerful and intentional. For once, the officers who'd brutalized a black woman were being treated exactly like the people they'd spent their careers arresting. While the criminal cases proceeded through the slow machinery of the justice system, grand jury indictments, arraignments, pretrial motions, discovery disputes, all the procedural steps that would eventually lead to trial, Vivian Crawford was dealing with the physical and psychological aftermath of the assault. She underwent surgery on her knee 2 weeks after the incident, a 2-hour orthopedic procedure that involved cleaning out the torn meniscus and stabilizing the fractured patella with 4 surgical screws that would remain in her knee permanently. The surgery was successful from a technical standpoint, but the recovery was long and painful. 6 weeks of extremely limited mobility where she could barely walk even with crutches. 3 months of intensive physical therapy, 3 sessions per week, working to rebuild the strength and range of motion in her damaged knee. Even a year later, she would still have a slight limp when she was tired, still feel pain when the weather changed, still carry the permanent physical reminder of what had been done to her. But the physical injuries, as serious and as permanent as they were, weren't the hardest part of her recovery. The psychological trauma ran deeper and lasted longer. Vivian began therapy twice weekly with Dr. Helena Winters, the forensic psychiatrist who diagnosed her PTSD. They worked through exposure therapy, cognitive processing techniques, strategies for managing the panic attacks that had started occurring whenever Vivian saw police cars or heard sirens. She had nightmares, vivid, horrifying nightmares where she was back on that highway, hitting the pavement over and over, unable to stand, unable to escape, while officers stood over her discussing her as less than human. She developed anxiety around law enforcement that she'd never experienced before in her life. Before the assault, Vivian had felt generally neutral about police. She'd never had particularly positive or negative encounters, had viewed them as a necessary part of civil society, had never felt the kind of fear that many black people described. But after being brutalized by Officer Brennan, after hearing that 7-minute conversation, everything changed. Now when she saw a patrol car in her rearview mirror, her heart raced and her palms got sweaty and she had to consciously remind herself to breathe. Now when she was pulled over for any reason, even something as minor as a broken taillight, she experienced full panic attacks, hyperventilating and crying, unable to control her body's fear response even though her rational mind knew she wasn't in immediate danger. The woman who'd built a billion-dollar company from nothing, who'd pitched to skeptical venture capitalists without breaking a sweat, who testified before Congress about complex cybersecurity issues with perfect composure, was now afraid of routine interactions with police. The trauma was real, documented, and lasting. But Vivian was also angry. And she channeled that anger into action. 3 months after the assault, the city of Wilmington's attorneys approached Amara Mitchell with a settlement offer. $3.5 million. Standard confidentiality agreement. No admission of wrongdoing by the city or the department. Amara brought the offer to Vivian and laid it out plainly. This is insulting. They brutalized you. They called you an ape and a pig. They stole your property. They charged you with fabricated crimes. They created a culture that allowed officers like Brennan to operate with impunity for years. And they want to pay you $3.5 million and make you sign a non-disclosure agreement so that nobody ever hears about it again, so that nothing changes, so that the next black woman who gets pulled over by the next racist cop they hire has no idea what she's walking into. What should we ask for? Vivian wanted to know. $15 million minimum, Amara said firmly. Plus a comprehensive consent decree requiring actual systemic reform with civilian oversight and real consequences for violations. Plus a public apology from the city council and the police chief, on camera, unscripted, acknowledging what they did and what they allowed to happen. Plus the criminal prosecutions moving forward non-negotiably. Vivian considered this for a long moment, and then she smiled for the first time in weeks, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. Counter at $20 million. $20 million? Even Amara seemed slightly surprised by the number. They need to understand that racism is expensive, Vivian explained, her voice calm but absolutely certain. That brutality costs actual money, that you can't just pay black victims to shut up and go away anymore for whatever amount feels convenient. $20 million is expensive enough to hurt their budget, expensive enough that every city council member and every police administrator and every taxpayer in Wilmington will remember this case, will remember my name, will remember what it costs when you hire and protect racist cops. Amara countered at $18 million. The city came back at $5 million. Rejected. $7 million. Rejected. $9 million. Rejected. The negotiations continued for weeks, with the city slowly realizing that Vivian and Amara weren't bluffing, that they were absolutely prepared to take this case to trial and put every single ugly detail on public display for months if that's what it took to get real accountability. Finally, exactly 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, the city made their final offer, $11.2 million, the largest civil rights settlement in North Carolina history, larger than any previous police misconduct payout in the state's entire judicial record. But Vivian still had her non-negotiable conditions, and the city agreed to all of them. Officer Kyle Brennan's criminal trial began 8 months after he'd pulled Vivian Crawford over for speeding. His defense attorney tried every possible strategy to create reasonable doubt or minimize the severity of the charges. He argued that Vivian had seemed suspicious, and that Brennan's aggressive response was justified by officer safety concerns and reasonable caution in a potentially dangerous situation. The prosecution played the video showing Vivian sitting calmly in her vehicle with both hands visible on the steering wheel, making no threatening movements whatsoever. The defense argued that Brennan had feared for his life, based on his training and experience. The prosecution pointed out that Vivian was unarmed, was half Brennan's size, was completely compliant with every command, and posed absolutely no credible threat. The defense argued that the conversation in the patrol car was taken out of context, and didn't reflect Brennan's true beliefs, but was rather stress-induced venting after a tense encounter. The prosecution played the full 7 minutes and 43 seconds of audio twice, once during opening arguments and once during closing arguments, letting the jury hear every single racist word in complete context. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, not because there was any real question about guilt, but because they wanted to be absolutely certain they'd considered every piece of evidence carefully and thoroughly given the seriousness of the charges. The verdicts came back, guilty on all counts. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, the judge, Justice Patricia Coleman, a black woman who'd been appointed to the bench after a distinguished career as a prosecutor, delivered a statement that would be quoted in law school courses on civil rights litigation and criminal justice reform for years to come. Officer Brennan, you were given a badge, a gun, and the public's trust. You were sworn to protect and serve all citizens equally, without regard to race, religion, economic status, or any other characteristic. You took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States and to respect the civil rights of every person you encountered in your official capacity. Instead, you brutalized a woman whose only violation was driving 14 miles per hour over the speed limit. You threw her to the ground 3 times with such force that you shattered her kneecap and caused injuries that will affect her for the rest of her life. You spoke about her, and about all black people, as subhuman animals, as apes, as pigs, with the kind of casual certainty that suggests these aren't aberrant thoughts but deeply held beliefs that have informed your policing decisions throughout your entire career. This court cannot undo the trauma you inflicted on Dr. Crawford. We cannot erase the fear she now carries every time she sees a police officer. We cannot restore the sense of safety and dignity that you stole from her. But we can ensure that you never have the opportunity to do this to anyone else. Officer Kyle Brennan, you are hereby sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from any law enforcement position or any other position of public authority. And you will register as having committed a hate crime, a designation that will follow you and limit your opportunities for the rest of your natural life. Brennan, who had maintained an expression of defiant anger throughout the entire trial, finally broke when the sentence was read. He wept openly as he was led away in handcuffs. Officer Jericho Webb, whose charges were less severe but whose complicity was undeniable, accepted a plea deal rather than face trial. 2 years in prison, 3 years of probation, permanent ban from law enforcement. At his sentencing hearing, he did something that Brennan had never done and would never do. He apologized directly to Vivian. "Ms. Crawford," he said, his voice shaking with emotion that seemed genuine, "I know that my words can't undo what happened to you. I know that an apology is inadequate and probably too late and doesn't change anything about your experience or your trauma. But I need to say it anyway. I didn't hit you. I didn't throw you to the ground. I didn't put my hands on you. But I stood there and I watched it happen and I said absolutely nothing. I did nothing to stop it. I did nothing to help you. That makes me guilty too. What Kyle said in that car, about you, about black people generally, was disgusting and wrong and completely unacceptable. I should have challenged him. I should have reported him years ago when I first heard him express those views. I knew he thought this way. I'd heard him say similar things before, and I stayed silent because speaking up might have cost me my career, might have made me unpopular with other officers, might have created problems for me. But my silence cost you so much more. Your safety, your dignity, your sense of security in the world. I'm sorry. I know it's not enough. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I am genuinely, truly sorry." Vivian, seated in the courtroom gallery with Amara beside her, nodded slightly when Webb finished speaking. She didn't forgive him. Forgiveness wasn't required, and the trauma he'd helped create through his inaction couldn't be erased by an apology. But she acknowledged his accountability, which was more than most officers ever provided to their victims. The $11.2 million settlement came with Vivian's comprehensive conditions, and the city agreed to implement every single one of them. The settlement agreement that the city of Wilmington signed wasn't just about money, though $11.2 million was certainly significant and sent a message about the cost of tolerating racist policing. The agreement included a detailed consent decree that would govern the police department's operations for a minimum of 5 years, with specific requirements that created real accountability. Every single officer in the Wilmington Police Department, all 127 sworn personnel, was required to undergo comprehensive implicit bias training, not just once but quarterly for 3 full years. The training couldn't be the standard superficial 8-hour seminar that most departments use to check a compliance box. It had to be intensive, evidence-based, facilitated by outside experts with proven track records in reducing racially biased policing. Body cameras that could not be manually deactivated during any interaction with members of the public were installed on every officer, with automatic disciplinary consequences for any officer who tampered with or attempted to disable recording equipment. Any officer with a substantiated complaint of racial bias would be immediately terminated with no possibility of appeal or reinstatement. A civilian oversight board with independent subpoena power and the authority to conduct investigations separate from the department's internal affairs division was created, with board members elected by the community rather than appointed by the police chief or city council. And comprehensive traffic stop data had to be collected, analyzed, and published monthly with complete transparency about stops by race, neighborhood, time of day, and outcome. Beyond the structural reforms, Vivian demanded and received a formal public apology ceremony. On a bright October morning 6 months after the assault, Mayor Linda Harrison, Police Chief Thomas Randall, and all 7 members of the City Council stood on the steps of Wilmington City Hall before a crowd of over 3,000 people, community members, activists, media representatives from around the country, and ordinary citizens who'd been moved by Vivian's case and wanted to witness this moment of accountability. Mayor Harrison spoke first, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of institutional failure. On behalf of the city of Wilmington and its residents, I offer our deepest, most sincere apology to Dr. Vivian Crawford for what was done to her by officers we hired, trained, equipped with badges and weapons, and empowered to act in our name. What happened to Dr. Crawford was not a mistake. It was not an unfortunate misunderstanding or a regrettable incident. It was a brutal, racist assault carried out by officers who held deeply racist beliefs and who felt comfortable expressing those beliefs because we, the city leadership, the police department, the community that remained silent, had created a culture where such beliefs could exist without consequence. We failed Dr. Crawford catastrophically. We failed our black residents who have been telling us for years that they don't feel safe, that they're targeted, that they're treated as threats rather than citizens. We failed our entire community by allowing a culture of racism to fester and grow and poison what should be an institution dedicated to serving everyone equally. We cannot undo what was done to Dr. Crawford. But we commit here and now, publicly and with the accountability of this consent decree, to fundamental and lasting change. Vivian stood to accept the apology, her mother Dorothy beside her for support, both women standing straight and dignified despite everything they'd endured. I accept this apology, Vivian said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, not because words can heal what was broken, but because accountability has to start somewhere. Officer Brennan is in prison. Officer Webb is in prison. But systemic racism in policing doesn't end with individual consequences for individual officers. It ends when communities demand better and refuse to accept less. What happened to me happens every single day to black people across this country. People who don't have the resources to hire attorneys like Amara Mitchell, who don't have platforms that get their stories heard, who don't have video evidence, who don't have the privilege of wealth and education that sometimes, not always but sometimes, provides a small measure of protection. This settlement, these reforms, this moment, none of it is about me alone. It's about every black person who's been pulled over for no reason other than the color of their skin. Every black person who's been brutalized and then told they were resisting when they were complying. Every black person who's been called an ape, a thug, a threat by people who wear badges and carry guns. We deserve better. We've always deserved better. And I will spend the rest of my life working to make sure we get it. The $11.2 million settlement changed Vivian's life, but not in the way that most people might expect. She didn't retire from Axiom Technologies or step back from the company she'd built. Instead, she threw herself into her work with renewed intensity and purpose, using her platform and her success to advocate for change. But she also created something entirely new, the Crawford Foundation for Police Accountability and Community Safety, a nonprofit organization funded with $5 million from her settlement plus matching donations from tech industry leaders who rallied around her cause. The foundation had 3 core missions: providing free legal representation to victims of police misconduct who couldn't afford attorneys, developing and distributing free body camera and dashcam applications that civilians could use to document police encounters, and funding community safety alternatives including mental health crisis response teams and de-escalation training programs. Within its first year of operation, the Crawford Foundation provided legal support to 89 families across 14 states. Families who would otherwise have had no recourse against police violence because they couldn't afford the 6-figure cost of civil rights litigation. Vivian became a national voice on police reform issues, testifying before Congress on 4 separate occasions, consulting with the Department of Justice on federal policy recommendations, speaking at universities about technology's role in creating transparency and accountability. The case that started with a speeding ticket became required training material in police academies across America. Not as an example of proper procedure, obviously, but as a cautionary tale about what happens when racist beliefs inform policing decisions and when officers believe they can act with impunity. Officer Kyle Brennan is currently serving year 3 of his 7-year federal sentence at a correctional facility in Kentucky. He'll be eligible for parole in 2027, and upon release he'll be permanently barred from law enforcement with a hate crime designation that will follow him for the rest of his life. Officer Jericho Webb completed his 2-year sentence and is currently on probation, working in construction, having spoken publicly on 2 occasions about his failure to intervene and expressing what appears to be genuine remorse. The Wilmington Police Department has had 0 substantiated complaints of racial bias in the 3 years since the Crawford reforms were implemented, the longest stretch without such complaints in the department's entire documented history. Whether this represents actual cultural change or merely better suppression of complaints remains a subject of ongoing debate and monitoring by the Civilian Oversight Board. Vivian Crawford continues to run Axiom Technologies, which is now valued at $2.1 billion and has expanded into new markets and new technologies. The Crawford Foundation has provided free legal representation to over 300 families and has distributed body camera technology to communities in 37 states. She still has nightmares sometimes about hitting the pavement, still carries the physical scars, the slight limp from her knee surgery, the faint scar on her temple where her head struck the asphalt, the careful way she moves her shoulders on cold mornings when the old rotator cuff injuries ache. But she also carries something else, the knowledge that her pain wasn't wasted, that her willingness to fight back created space and resources for others to do the same, that her case contributed to meaningful change even though the work is far from finished. The body camera footage has been viewed over 200 million times across all platforms worldwide. It's used in police academy training programs. It's cited in federal court cases as precedent. It's referenced in legislation. And every time someone sees it, every time they hear Officer Brennan say that black people look like apes and are dirty like pigs, they're forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Racism in policing isn't theoretical or historical. It's real, it's current, it's documented, and it's still happening every single day across America. But because of Vivian Crawford, because of her courage, because of her refusal to accept injustice quietly, because of her willingness to make herself vulnerable by going public with her trauma, the cost of that racism just got significantly higher. $11.2 million higher. 7 years in federal prison higher. A permanent hate crime designation higher. A consent decree requiring systemic reform higher. Maybe that's expensive enough to make some officers reconsider before they brutalize the next black person they encounter. Maybe it's enough to make some police departments think twice before they hire officers with racist beliefs or protect officers with patterns of racially biased conduct. Maybe it's enough to create the beginning of real accountability. Maybe not. The work continues. The struggle persists. The need for change remains urgent. But it's a start. And sometimes, a start is all we have. Until people like Vivian Crawford transform that start into momentum, that momentum into movement, that movement into justice. Vivian Crawford's story is extraordinary in its documentation and its outcome, but the experience she survived is tragically common for Black Americans who encounter law enforcement. Her wealth and her platform gave her resources that most victims of police brutality never have access to, but her courage and her refusal to accept injustice created change that benefits everyone. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see police accountability differently, then we need you to take action right now. Subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV if you haven't already. We're building a community dedicated to telling powerful Black stories that mainstream media often ignores. Hit that like button to boost this video in the algorithm. Drop a comment sharing your reaction, your thoughts, or your own experiences. And share this video as widely as possible because stories like Vivian's need to be heard, need to be amplified, need to create the kind of public pressure that forces institutions to change. Every subscription matters. Every like counts. Every share extends our reach. Join us in celebrating justice, truth, and the powerful Black narratives that deserve to be heard.